Part two with Joseph Torigian on his magisterial Xi Zhongxun biography. We pick up the narrative from our first episode at 1949.
1949, Xi Zhongxun is king of the Northwest. Now, this presages 3 to 4 years in which he will be moved into a very important position, moving into Beijing. But I'm curious, is there something of particular note here that of Xi Zhongxun's own accomplishments that warrants this promotion? Or is it, I think you mentioned this in the book, that Mao is very concerned about these 6 regions in which he's divided China up at this time and wants to restructure them. But what would you pull out from this 3 to 4 year period where Xi Zhongxun is king of the Northwest that is of particular note?
Two things in particular that I think are interesting. One is how he's dealing with ethnic minorities. So the Northwest includes Xinjiang, but it also includes Qinghai, Gansu, other provinces with many Hui Muslims, but also Tibetan Buddhists. And so this process of incorporating these regions into the regime is very bloody. It's the crushing of an insurrection. But what we see is at the same time, Xi Zhongxun is learning certain things about how to deal with ethnic minorities. He's recognizing the value of winning over local power brokers, of not going too far too fast, of pursuing socialism in a way that's less costly. In fact, in 1952, he purges these 2 leaders from Xinjiang who pursued land reform in the nomadic areas and were suppressing at a level that Xi Zhongxun thought was inappropriate. And in fact, he says at one point that to do work in the Northwest means doing ethnic politics and doing the United Front. So it's an important moment for him because in later years he would spend so much time on ethnic politics, and he seems to have drawn lessons from this period. The other is that in the early years of the People's Republic of China, there were all of these campaigns where Mao was trying to figure out how the regime could solidify and also prevent the party from becoming divorced from the masses. So there's this campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, and there's all these interesting questions about whether Xi Zhongxun was pursuing an agenda that was relatively humane or not, and how much he was listening to Mao and how much he was working on his own. There were these anti-corruption campaigns, the situation right in terms of doing what Mao wants him to do or expects him to do, although certainly Xi Zhongxun's absolute priority is to intuit what Mao wants and bring it to him better than anyone else can. And he doesn't do perfectly, but he does a good enough job that Mao says something very striking to this man named Bo Yibo, who of course is the father of the notorious Bo Xilai. He says that Xi Zhongxun is like the blue flame in the Taoist stove that creates these elixirs, the process of alchemy. And Mao always uses phrases that can be interpreted in many different ways, deliberately so, as the sage king. And part of it, I think, was this idea that Xi Zhongxun had spent so much time at the grassroots that he had really dealt with the peasants and had been, forged by them. But he also knew how much suffering Xi Zhongxun had gone through, including at the hands of his own party, and yet remained loyal to the party. But this was a famous phrase, a phrase that people would associate with Xi Zhongxun as Mao giving him essentially the highest, most superlative way of describing him as an individual. It's around that time, as you said, he's brought to Beijing. He's not the only one brought to Beijing from a major bureau. Another person who was brought was a man named Deng Xiaoping. And so to be, along with Deng, one of the 5 horses who entered the capital, especially because, once again, he was by far the youngest of the 5 horses, is really another credit to Xi Zhongxun's career that makes him stand out. And this was Mao Zedong possibly trying to balance against people like Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi. It was partly possibly him trying to make sure that these guys who had spent so many years in these bureaus didn't slip out of the control of the central government. But for whatever reason, Xi Zhongxun is brought to the capital and he is made Minister of Propaganda. So he is assigned the task of figuring out how to explain to hundreds of millions of people how they're going to build communism and why they should believe in communism, which is both a very ideological thing, but also a very concrete thing, a very practical thing. How exactly you achieve literacy and what you're going to have them read and how you're going to produce what it is that they're going to read, and whether or not you're going to work with intellectuals and inspire intellectuals, or you're going to really scare them and tell them exactly what to do. And they're struggling and they're figuring things out. And Xi Zhongxun's story is part of that.
I don't know if we mentioned this yet, but the name of the book is also derives from something that Mao wrote to to Xi. Maybe we can linger on, you mentioned the Xinjiang purge, as it was, and the two people you're referring to, I believe, unless there were lower level ones, is Wang Zhen and Deng Xiaoping.
Very interesting people.
Very interesting. But I would like if we can maybe discuss the sort of enmities that form in this period, or that may form in this period, that sort of linger onwards. And maybe also what you think of factions as a framework. Wang Zhen, Deng Xiaoping, but also Deng Xiaoping, who's leading the Southwest Bureau. This is a point at which she kind of runs into problems with them that you could argue sort of linger on for the next 30 plus years of their lives. What do you make of that?
So one of the things I tried to get across with the book was the sprawl of party history. I think maybe that's the best word for it, right? I mean, these were people who knew each other for decades, and they often didn't like each other, but they also still had emotional attachments to one another. And of course, all of these feelings are refracted through the party. And it's a party that is very leader friendly. And it's a party in which if you act as a small group, if you act as a faction, it's extremely dangerous for you. So certainly people have affections for each other, or they have dislikes for each other, or they have career ties, or they happen to have similar views of a policy issue. But at the same time, even when they hate each other, they're still kind of frenemies in a sense, because they have to work with each other. They recognize this norm of putting the party's interests first. So even when they're really going after each other, there are certain limitations, especially in terms of how much they can do that in concert with allies, right? Because as soon as you start forming a small group, then you're vulnerable to this charge of factionalism.
And if I'm not mistaken, though, this is a key area in which Xi Zhongxun does come across as something of a reformer, or in moral terms, sort of a nicer guy. In the Xinjiang example, he wants to use the local power brokers, who are these religious figures, and he wants to not excessively go after them, because, for the party, these other commitments to religions and these other things are, if not threatening, at least seem very backward to them, and things could get out of hand. But she seems to wants to put turn down that flame. And when it comes to Tibet, which the Southwestern Bureau that Deng is leading ends up having responsibility for, going in there as opposed to the Northwestern Bureau. I don't know what you would have, if she might have had a slightly less...
You're asking whether we can essentialize him in particular ways with regards to ethnic politics. That's what you're asking,
Sure.
Right? Like, is he systematically different from other people in a way that's more humane, in a way that's more moral, in a way that's less radical? And I could give you lots of examples where he has differences of opinions with people in the elite, where he seems to be the person who wants to take a more gradual approach, a less violent approach that's more about economic growth, addressing grievances, bringing religion into the open so that it can be controlled, forging alliances with people who have prestige and status within their own communities as a vector for communist power. But on the other hand, we should think about that in a relative sense. One is that these are just other tools of control. Maybe they're more efficient tools, but ultimately his final objective is the same as everyone else, which is socialist transformation and dominance of these borderlands and placing them under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's lots of examples where he doesn't come off as a softliner, right? So yeah, what you talked about in Xinjiang, that seems like a rather obvious case. But on Tibet, right, what's interesting is that Xi Zhongxun has this very close relationship with the Panchen Lama. So the Panchen Lamas, they have a falling out with the Dalai Lamas decades before, and the 10th Panchen Lama is born in Qinghai, and he's a young person. And the party, especially Xi Zhongxun, sees the Panchen Lama as more progressive and a more natural ally to the party who can be used to pursue transformation faster. And then people like Deng Xiaoping actually like the Dalai Lama and say, look, the Dalai Lama is so powerful that we have to work with him, and that we can only go so far with the Panchen Lama, and we should only go so quickly with regards to transformation in Tibet. And in 1959, the Dalai Lama flees. And the people from the Northwest, like Xi Zhongxun, they feel vindicated because they never trusted the Dalai Lama. And they thought that, they should try to empower the Panchen Lama at the expense of the Dalai Lama so that they can achieve socialist transformation more rapidly. And of course, while Xi Zhongxun is deeply involved in ethnic politics, this now in the State Council in the late 1950s, the party is literally at war with these areas that Xi Zhongxun had incorporated into the regime. It's literally fighting a war against people in Qinghai and Gansu. And Xi Zhongxun is working, with the Ethnic Affairs Commission, right? And so, yeah, he had a sensitivity. At the very least, he had an intuition for how to work with people when he wanted to, which wasn't a very common characteristic of these guys, right? So when he interviewed the Dalai Lama, he talked about how people often were very rude to him, and they would just say things about what he was wearing and, just these remarks and that kind of thing. And, whether Xi Zhongxun liked him or not, the Dalai Lama felt like he did. And that was a credit to Xi Zhongxun's ability not only to do what the party wanted, which was to win over the Dalai Lama, whatever his views might have been, but because he could be rather charming when he wanted to, right? Which is a somewhat rare talent in the Chinese Communist Party.
And I think sort of in the theme of Gray's, like, you have this quote later on where is he like, we need to kill people to do revolution or something?
That was when it was probably the campaign of against counter-revolutionaries, the suppression of counter-revolutionaries campaign, I believe, when he uses very Stalinist language about how the bad guys are going to become more brazen because we're doing so well, which means that they're scared, which means that they're going to be more dangerous, which is kind of a way of saying that, there are enemies because we're successful, not because we're screwing up, which means that we need to kill them and not win them over because there's something inherently wrong with them.
Yeah. And I think sort of that as a illustration for, like, if we're doing moral judgments, he was not the one to roll the tanks into Tibet, right? And that was ultimately more of a Deng Mao thing than it was a Xi Zhongxun thing. But the fact that, these, as John simplified, like, yes, they're killers, but they're like killers at scale, and they're killers in a sort of very dogmatic way, and it is more sort of the means of whether we can do this slightly easier or slightly more aggressive, which I think is kind of the right frame, as opposed to projecting back this man as like a sort of liberal bulwark in a revolutionary time where he was, one of the leading revolutionaries.
Well, one other thing to say about the United Front that's really interesting is his life shows an inherent dilemma. So what's the United Front? So the United Front was described by Mao as one of the three treasures of the party's toolkit. And it's essentially a way of figuring out who likes you, who's wishy-washy about you, and who hates you. And then you empower the people that like you win over the people that are in the middle, and you either isolate or destroy the dead-enders. And that is a very intuitive idea, right? It's sort of what politics is all about. But for the party, it's really hard to get right. First of all, because judging which people fall into what group is totally arbitrary and often very hard to figure out, right? And then the question is, okay, so when you are winning people over, you can see how that requires listening to them. It means making them feel that they can speak out and not get punished. It means empowering them so that their communities still have faith in them. And all of those things are dangerous, because what happens if those people actually take you at your word and say things that other people don't like, people that don't like you, right? And so you're the party. You've taken over the country. You have conquered the nation. So a lot of people are like, why are we paying attention to these people at all? Why don't we just kill them or throw them in jail? We're the ones who won. Why do we have any need to accommodate these people? So when, for example, in 1957, the anti-rightist campaign, it was doubly embarrassing for Xi Zhongxun because he's working at the state council, and there's lots of people who are not members of the Chinese Communist Party working there, and he's one of the people who tells them to speak out. And then they do, and then they get punished for it, right? And so the party is probably mad at him for not handling these people better, so they didn't complain in the first place. And these people also feel betrayed that Xi Zhongxun told them to, that they would be safe, and then they weren't. So in 1962, one of the accusations against Xi Zhongxun is that he was too accommodationist to the Panchen Lama, and that's why the Panchen Lama made all of these criticisms of party policy. And so you get this question, right? Like, they return to it in the 1980s, which is, when you give space for people within the party to speak up, at one point do you co-opt them, and at one point do they take advantage of you? And which is which? And so in the 1980s, there's this debate. They're like, oh my gosh, there's all these people protesting. Why are they protesting now when we're being so much nicer to them than we were in the past? And it's like, in a way, like, it's kind of clueless, right? Because people protest. That's what they do. And by the way, maybe the grievances that you've laid down are really bad grievances. So it's not surprising that people will be really upset. And then maybe, well, actually, you haven't gone far enough to give them other opportunities to complain, or maybe you haven't done enough to make them happy. But other people are saying, we've done so much and you're still not happy. And so there's this interesting quote by Hu Yaobang where he's just kind of stunned that people in Tibet are protesting, but also he's someone who brought this whole new model that seemed so insightful and so open to possibilities. And it's interesting because it speaks to the heart of authoritarianism, right? Which is when you co-opt and when you repress and how you decide and how you do it and who you decide which is which and how you interpret certain behavior as either threatening or the system working. And it's not easy to get right, especially when there's a lot of other people in the system who don't like you and will, when you make a mistake, won't work with you to figure out a better way of doing it, but accuse you of ideological heresy, of being either too left or too right. So doing United Front is really hard. That's my answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the rate of change question, both for sort of party discipline as well as how you treat these like restive regions, is a really interesting one. And it comes back to the Tocqueville thing about how, like, the revolutions happen when you give people a little bit and then you take it away, or the trajectory changes. And it's sort of, you let up a little bit and then people are like, oh my God, maybe they won't kill me if I tell them that I would actually like to pray every once in a while. But yeah, it's a hard thing to process if you're sort of as abstracted away as you are as a Hu Yaobang. And yeah, maybe your soul is a little softer and you don't necessarily want to be burning everyone's temples, but like you want to be in control too. So
Also, maybe we can take a moment here. United Front is one of DC policy circles' favorite sort of boogeyman, hiding behind potentially every organization. But reading your book is very interesting because I imagine this might be replaying nowadays that people did not actually want to oftentimes work with United Front, not only because it was low status, but also because you might run the risk of being associated with people who will get you in trouble.
The vector can go in both directions. And if you tell the party, hey, these people are telling me stuff that make them unhappy, and they're like, well, why are you telling me that they're unhappy and not telling them to stop being unhappy? It's an implicit criticism of the party when you voice their criticisms for them. And so, right, you're right. I actually thought about this a lot, which is like people are really afraid of the United Front. But one of the things my book shows is that, first of all, it's really hard to do the United Front well. Second, you can get in trouble for not doing it well. And third, you just don't like doing it because it means listening to people you may not actually really like all that much, right? So, but then on the other hand, like, intuitively and empirically, you can see why it is also nevertheless a very powerful thing. But at the very least, what I hope my book can do is show that even though it is something that the party has used very effectively in the past, it's not something that's perfect. And it's actually something that it's easy to get wrong, and that the party does get it wrong pretty regularly. So,
yeah. And I think there's a parallel there to like actually listening to the masses, right? Where on the one hand, like, yes, we're the Communist Party. Of course, we're going to listen to the masses. The masses are going to lead us. But, maybe you can talk about this in the context of Xi running the kind of like remonstration bureau and the challenges that you have from actually like bringing up these voices of complaints about the party's actions to the central government more broadly.
Yeah. So, during the Mao era, Xi Zhongxun was an important person, but he wasn't a leading figure per se, right? I mean, he was a vice premier. That's a big deal. But nevertheless, what he was doing was so revealing during the Great Leap Forward. Why? Because he's working for the state council. And that's interesting for a lot of reasons, especially his relationship with Zhou Enlai, the state council's relationship with the secretariat, what happens to Peng Dehuai, this close associate of Xi Zhongxun. But it's also interesting because, as you said, he's running like the petition bureau management system for the state council. And so what is the petition bureau? What are petitions? Well, formally, Chinese citizens had a right to go to Beijing to complain or to write messages to the party center to complain. And for a party that was deeply worried about becoming divorced from the masses, you can see why, in principle, this is something that they should take seriously, and often did, because you want to know what they're thinking. You want to know what's going through their heads. And there were a lot of tensions in Chinese society during the 1950s. And of course, they accelerated in dramatic ways during the Great Leap Forward. But then you get into the politics of information control in a Leninist system, especially at a moment of crisis, and especially in a moment where you have one leader who is so dominant and so frightening and so mercurial. So one of the themes of the book is how dangerous the politics of course correction are in the Leninist system. So here's Xi Zhongxun. He probably knows better than most people within the elite about how bad things are going, but he has to figure out when and where to pick his battles. And he also appreciates that the information he's getting probably often is not perfect because, as he admits in a speech that he gives that's rather remarkable, he knows that local party officials are arresting people who are trying to complain at the top leadership. And so when there's famine everywhere and you're trying to get a sense of how serious it is, they return to the Petition Bureau and they're like, we're not getting nearly as many complaints as we used to. Now, of course, if you're getting a lot of complaints and you're reporting on a lot of complaints, people might say, the Great Leap Forward is going great. Why are you taking these complaints seriously and not like hunting down the people who are complaining as saboteurs or trying to destroy this wonderful thing that's going so well? So, he's watching Mao. Mao often changes his mind, not because of people who are high ranking and have a lot of information showing him the evidence, but sometimes it's his family that actually changes Mao's mind, which is, quite interesting and revealing. And then in the 1980s, we haven't talked about this yet, but one of the most interesting roles for Xi Zhongxun is he has 2 stints at the National People's Congress. And this is a moment when they're trying to figure out whether the NPC can be something more than a rubber stamp, but they're also thinking a lot about the rule of law and how you can use the rule of law and whether you can use the rule of law and what the rule of law means for the party and party control. And so there's these debates about whether it can be used as an effective tool, but there's tons of crime in the 1980s, right? Because the Cultural Revolution had been so damaging to society, and reform is in trouble if you can't get a handle on it. So they decide to do the Strike Hard campaign. So even though Xi Zhongxun really says remarkable things about how seriously he takes the rule of law, he's also still sensitive to these exigencies of the situation and allows himself even then to allow the party to do things that have negative effects on that trajectory.
Maybe we can back up a little bit. The Gao Gang affair. I'm curious what you think of it from the perspective of factions, and maybe thinking about it from there are alternative perspectives. Some people like Victor Schur and Coalitions of the Weak. Other people who look at factions and maybe think of it as these are more durable networks. It's very popular today. There's several websites that are very interesting and good. You can go to. You can see how they think people sort of fit into certain factions based on where they worked or where they grew up or whatnot. And Xi Zhongxun obviously falls victim to this from an inter-party perspective, people who think there might be a faction between Gao Gang and Xi Zhongxun and other people from the Northwest. But I don't know if your evidence that you've drawn up really seems to lead to that conclusion. So maybe you could lay out from that perspective and sort of overview what the Gao Gang affair actually was about.
Yeah. So faction is one of these words that, like ideology, it depends on which definition of faction that you're using. I think that if you reify this idea of faction, you have this image of cohesive blocks that work closely with one another because they happen to have had career ties, then that's very misleading. On the other hand, to say that these historical ties don't matter at all would also be misleading. But I think that right now maybe some work, precisely because it's easy to measure these career ties, that then people pay a lot of attention to it. And I think that kind of thing is very valuable, but it still needs to be put into the context of what the party is all about. And what does the party do? Well, it makes you put the party's interests first, and factions are a violation of that norm. Factions are one of the great taboos of party culture. So it's clumpy, but it's not blocky, if that makes sense. So the Gao Gang affair, this is a foundational moment in Chinese Communist Party history because it's the first great purge of the People's Republic of China. And so Gao Gang and Xi Zhongxun are both Northwesterners. They have a relationship with each other. Were they acting in a factional way? Well, not really, actually. In fact, Xi Zhongxun was telling Gao Gang to be careful. He wasn't really supporting Gao Gang in his machinations. And he thought that Gao Gang was acting in a very dangerous way, right? And then Gao Gang, of course, goes too far. Xi Zhongxun says, I told you about Chen Yun, you didn't listen to me, this kind of thing. And then when Gao goes down, Xi Zhongxun is very upset. He's very unhappy. But nevertheless, he goes along with the party's decision. And he says these terrible things about Gao Gang. And if they're a faction, then why didn't Xi Zhongxun go down along with Gao Gang? The reason for that is how far a purge goes, who's included in the purge, how the purge is characterized is an art form that is shaped by a myriad of different considerations that are only fully understood by the top leader. And so in that sense, you can see that historical ties mattered, but that if we take them too far they can be very misleading.
And just for people who maybe don't remember what happened in the 1950s, it was Gao basically seeking out and seeing if he could get support for maybe, if I'm remembering this right, displacing Liu Shaoqi as the presumed successor, if I have that right.
So what was going on was two things. First was Liu Shaoqi's problem wasn't that he was pursuing a different line than Mao Zedong. It wasn't like a cohesively different approach to the party than Mao Zedong. His problem was that he just wasn't lining up with Mao Zedong, right? And Mao was really unhappy about this. And so he starts complaining to people like Gao Gang about Liu Shaoqi. And then Gao Gang is motivated by his own historical antagonisms and his own distaste for Liu Shaoqi. And then Gao goes too far. He whispers to the wrong people, and they go to Mao and they say, Mao, we're worried about this. We think it's going to split the party. And then Mao decides to give up on Gao Gang. And he's accused of ridiculous things. And the attacks on him are so vociferous that Xi Zhongxun is frightened and surprised. In fact, he says, I've never seen the premiere like this. I've never seen Zhou Enlai like this. And in a way, the way that the purge of Gao Gang was characterized foreshadowed many other purges that would happen in subsequent years, because it showed that party members were not really treated like they were in a court of law, right? It wasn't like they were given a serious opportunity to explain themselves. There wasn't a objective adjudication of the evidence. It was Mao decided what was going to happen, and then everybody lined up, and that was the end of that, which was a violation of the party's own alleged norms at the time.
Let's talk a little bit about Mao and I guess like contingency, maybe, because we have this kind of arc and this model which Mao set up, which was followed by Deng and is now in Xi. And now in the Xi era, where basically like, you can argue about doctrine all you want, but at the end of the day, the top person is deciding, what direction the party's going, who's getting purged, who's not getting purged, and this, at least through the past 75 plus years, has seemed to be the readier steady state than anyone talking about collective leadership or sharing power or whatever. So when you think about this institution that she grew up with in this time period, I mean, I know we don't want to do counterfactuals, but like, what's your interpretation of to what extent this is just downstream of like a Leninist system or kind of Mao being Mao?
Well, there's different ways of thinking about this, right? One is that a person like Mao tends to rise to the head of an organization like the Communist Party, that people who are unlike Mao wouldn't be able to survive as heads of the Communist Party, or that once you're the head of a Communist Party, you become a Mao-like figure, right? So those are ways of thinking about counterfactuals that I think are very important. And so this question of possibilityhood is at the very heart of the study of not just China, but the Soviet Union, right? So in the Soviet Union, the question was, what if Bukharin, had been the successor and not Stalin? Or what if Mao had died in 1950 before the party had given up on this idea of new democracy, which was, putting off socialism, putting off violent transformation before Mao changed his mind, which is one of the reasons that Liu Shaoqi got caught up, is because he didn't realize Mao was changing his mind so quickly in that regard. Or in the 1980s, what if Deng Xiaoping had died in 84 or 85 and Hu Yaobang had become the top leader, right? And so these are really tough questions, but one thing that does emerge from the book that's relevant for this, even though it can't give a definitive conclusion, is that these are such leader-friendly systems. And they're systems that are so friendly that they make the leader behave in particular ways that are strikingly similar no matter who they are. And this emerges in particular in the story of Deng Xiaoping. Because Deng Xiaoping, more than anybody, should have understood the pathologies of the two-line system where you have a top leader and a deputy that breeds all of this distrust. And he should have understood better than anybody the pathologies of succession politics. And these two are, of course, related, because if the deputy isn't getting what you want, and this person might be the leader after you go, then that's a big problem, because you really want to make sure they're on board, because they don't want you to do a Khrushchev thing and de-Stalinize you after you're dead, or to violate your legacy. And so here we have Deng Xiaoping, who was purged by Mao twice, and this stuff about Deng opposing Mao or not being as radical as Mao, and that he was with Liu Shaoqi who were more pragmatic, it's been borne out in the evidence, right? We have a different understanding of this interim between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which is a story of Mao being distant and people misreading him as opposed to really a concerted effort to undermine him. And then in 1975, Deng Xiaoping is, brought back after he's purged a few years earlier and told to get the country back on its feet. And he thinks he's doing exactly what Mao wants him to do. And then people like Ye Jianming say, "Are you sure you understand what it is that Mao wants you to do?" And Deng says, "Oh, he trusts me. Of course he trusts me." And then, of course, he's purged again because he goes too far too quickly. And Mao, mercurial as ever, changes his mind. And then Deng, right, he purges Hu Yaobang. Says Hu Yaobang is not listening to him enough, not obeying him enough. He's incensed that Hu Yaobang agrees when Deng says that he's going to resign. Then Zhao Ziyang, right, he's not opposing Deng during the June 4 crisis. He's trying to figure out a way of saving Deng and protecting his authority while also not allowing a violent crackdown to happen. And then in 1992, Deng Xiaoping almost gets rid of Jiang Zemin. Right? And then this idea that Chen Yun or Li Xianyan reined him in and he didn't do it because they opposed him, that's not been borne out in the evidence that I've been able to collect, right? So, it's the puzzle here is quite striking, which is that these deputies never do oppose the top leader. That's clear from the evidence. The problem is that they keep misreading the top leader, and the top leader interprets it in this way that makes such more of a mountain out of a molehill than is really necessary, right? And whether or not they know that and they're doing it anyways, or whether they really believe it, whatever the reason, it's one of the fundamental factors that explains why elite politics in China has always been so explosive and why it's always been such a leader-friendly system.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the sort of the muscle memory of the purges, and that how this is the way to kind of like the personnel change is the way to sort of stamp your vision onto the system seems like something which is baked in from the very beginning. And I also think the other theme is, you talk about Deng and all the personnel moves as well as Mao and all the personnel moves is just age. Like these guys are old and they're making these decisions. And you can just like if you imagine like imagine a cranky person who, has lived through everything and really, really is convinced that they have all the answers. And kind of just to have someone be a little bit off that, you can, I don't know, I guess understand, how, if you just imagine like the most temperamental person, the most kind of like decisive, self-confident, temperamental person, and then like add on to that like 60 years of revolutionary history. And then like, maybe you get like 1/10 of what the sort of, I don't know, self-confidence and decisiveness that you see in a person like Mao and Deng. But interestingly, like the kind of transition between going from someone who is like subordinating themselves to another leader to being the leader yourself, or even like Xi Zhongxun at the very end of his life, once his career was over, to being like, look, I'm an independent person. I have views on this. And I think, there were some mistakes that maybe not everyone else agreed with, but like I thought were really dumb, is a very interesting and I think very maybe a more human way to relate to these folks.
Yeah, one other thing to say about this too is the Mao of the 1940s and much of the 1950s was very different from the Mao that later emerged. And Fred Tevis writes about this very eloquently, which is part of it was the story of hubris, right? Like, as you said, for Mao, think of what he had accomplished. Think about the legacy that he had forged. And so when things start going wrong with the Great Leap Forward and then the Cultural Revolution, these were events that were, even for Mao, clearly tragic failures. And it was one of the reasons why he was so worried about his legacy and why that made elite politics so explosive in so many ways. And Xi Zhongxun was always loyal to Mao, always loyal to Mao's memory, always someone who believed that Mao was a titan of Chinese history who deserved respect. But Xi Zhongxun also was not totally incapable of reflection. And so when he's talking about Mao as he's getting rehabilitated after the Cultural Revolution, he's talking about the Mao before the 1950s, or at least the Mao of the early 1950s. And you can see how he would be loyal to someone who was able to save the revolution, and actually for a very long time was known as someone who was rather pragmatic and flexible, and was known as someone who would take people he had defeated and let them stay in the leadership. Maybe they were given sinecures, but they weren't shot like they were in the Soviet Union, and the Chinese took some pride in that for some time. And then, of course, the purges started getting more
They started shooting people. Yeah.
Well, even in China, during the Cultural Revolution, most of the deaths were like persecution to death. They weren't executions. I mean, for Chinese citizens, many of them were executed, of course, but there weren't many executions of leading Chinese party officials during the Mao era or the Deng era, really, which is very different from the Soviet experience.
That's interesting. But so most of the senior leadership deaths were suicides.
Or just the physical torment was overwhelming. Yeah. Or you're not given treatment. Or, mentally, this is very, not easy to experience.
If you have the pleasure of listening to Joseph on more than one occasion, you may notice that when he says Deng, sometimes he will put an adjective before it, which is autocratic Deng, which is part of a project, I think, of revaluation of Deng, because not necessarily that he's good or bad, but he's been so lionized, I think, from his role. And so maybe if we can go back to the Great Leap Forward, because at this point, there does seem to be another enmity that sort of forms, or you could argue it does, as well as you see Xi Zhongxun again in a sort of role that you could see him more on the reformer side, where he's under the State Council of Zhou Enlai in 1957. But then 58, I believe I have the years right, Mao basically takes control of the economy out of the State Council to the Secretariat that Deng Xiaoping is running. So what do you make of this for enmity portion? And also then Deng becomes sort of the chief implementer for the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah.
Maybe you can speak on that a little.
So through the 1950s and early 1960s, there are a handful of areas where Deng and Xi saw some tension between each other. One is over Tibet. And this has come up already, but just to refresh for your listeners, Xi Zhongxun was head of the Northwest Bureau, and Deng Xiaoping was head of the Southwest Bureau. And the Panchen Lama was living in the Northwest Bureau in the last years of the revolution and the early years of the PRC when Xi Zhongxun was head of the Northwest Bureau, and they established a relationship. And Deng Xiaoping, on the other hand, was someone who was more supportive of the Dalai Lama. He thought that the party should not think that they could use the Panchen Lama as a weapon to undermine the Dalai Lama, and that would just be backfire, and that they needed to recognize the stature of the Dalai Lama in Tibetan society and work with him and win him over and get him to have faith in the communist cause, right? And so in the 1950s, you see this kind of a weird dance between the two of them. In a way, this is the closest part in my book to something resembling factions, right? Because you have these cadres from the Northwest Bureau in the Tibet Autonomous Region, and you have these cadres from the Southwest Bureau in the Tibet Autonomous Region, and they don't get along. In fact, they hate each other. And Xi Zhongxun is kind of the patron of the Northwest Bureau guys, and Deng Xiaoping is kind of the patron of the Southwest Bureau guys. So on the one hand, they're supporting their proteges, but on the other hand, they're reining them in and not letting them go too far. And Xi and Deng are expressing respect for each other and trying to work for each other, even though they have these different inclinations. It's such a delicate dance. It's such a delicate dance. And then, of course, you have the Gao Gang incident. And here, as I said earlier, Xi Zhongxun had said to Gao Gang, these are long marchers. These people aren't going to take us seriously. And Deng was a long marcher, right? And Deng played a fundamental role in the fall of Gao Gang. And when Xi Zhongxun was forced to do the self-criticisms and write reports about his relationship with Gao, the person who read them and went through them and asked Xi Zhongxun all these questions was Deng Xiaoping. Now, what's interesting is decades later, Deng Xiaoping would later say that when Gao Gang fell, we protected certain people and we promoted them, including Xi Zhongxun. So he's sort of taking credit for being good to Xi Zhongxun and helping him survive, although, of course, I'm sure for Xi Zhongxun it was an especially pleasant experience. Then, as you said, there's sort of another area of tension between them, which is about the relationship between the State Council and the Secretariat. So for some background, the State Council is the government apparatus, and it's run by Zhou Enlai. And the premiers include Chen Yun, one of the party's economic czars, Chen Yi, and Xi Zhongxun is essentially the secretary of the State Council. He runs its daily affairs. He works for Zhou Enlai. And then there's the Secretariat, which had been created to run party affairs. And that's run by Deng Xiaoping. And his right-hand man is Peng Zhen, a very interesting figure. And so Deng and Zhou basically get along. They respect each other. Peng Zhen hates Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai hates Peng Zhen for all of these historic reasons and personality reasons. And then there's this moment, right, where Mao decides that Zhou Enlai doesn't get it. And he takes control over the economy from the State Council and gives it to the Secretariat. People think Zhou Enlai might be removed from the leadership. He's going through this mental torment, and Xi Zhongxun is witnessing it. And then the Great Leap Forward is run by the Secretariat, where Deng and Peng are really true believers. And then, of course, in 1962, Xi Zhongxun is purged from the leadership, and it's a collective effort against him, and Deng Xiaoping plays a role. In fact, he eggs on one of the people who goes after Xi Zhongxun in the first place, this guy Yan Hongyan, who was from the Northwest. So then in the 1980s, right, like, it's impossible to say how much they're thinking about these antagonisms. Xi Zhongxun is certainly not happy that Deng Xiaoping doesn't allow Gao Gang to be rehabilitated. I'm sure that was something that grated on Xi Zhongxun. There's all these rumors that Xi Zhongxun will be the general secretary of the party, but it's Hu Yaobang instead, even though Hu Yaobang doesn't have nearly the prestige and status as Xi Zhongxun. So, whether Xi Zhongxun was unhappy about that, we don't know. But it was a way possibly of Deng using Xi, even though he didn't fully trust Xi. And then, of course, over the 1980s, Xi Zhongxun is increasingly unhappy with Deng's autocratic style. He's unhappy with how Hu Yaobang is treated, and then he's certainly unhappy with how Tiananmen Square goes down. But again, these are stories of frenemies, right? In a way. So it's not a story of Xi opposing Deng. It's not them having fundamentally different views of how the party should work. So it's once again sort of a complicated dance. And then, of course, on the big picture of reform and opening, Xi and Deng were quite close. And I'm sure that Xi was thrilled when Deng did the Southern Tour in 1992 and restarted reform. So I assume it was a complicated sense of emotions. And one last coda to this is in the 1990s, Xi Zhongxun said something very interesting, which is that we shouldn't give credit for all good things to Deng Xiaoping alone. Right? It wasn't just Deng.
Yeah, you mentioned this in the first episode of just like how your book gives a sense of the sprawl of party history across time, across geographies, and across these people who have these, half century of professional relationships and purge and counter purge and, ideological arguments and policy arguments and what have you. And I just want to like kind of emphasize to the readership that like just see like in the book kind of having it all be there in, this isn't a short book, but it's also not, a 2,000 page tome. And just to give you, it gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of these people and their relationships to the party and to their colleagues over time, and how it evolves and how just kind of like weighty and pressureful your kind of experience as a person and as a professional is over the course of these decades, which no other party history book has really given you a sense of. I think because the ones people first gravitate to, are the biographies of Zhou and of Deng and of Mao, and kind of Deng in the Deng early years, you get a bit of a sense of this, but I think like in the sort of like the top middle or like the bottom of the top, which I guess is where Xi Zhongxun ends
That's
up
a good way of putting it.
landing over the course of his career. There's just so many forces that are being kind of pressed upon you at all times, and you're on this religious mission, and there are all these trials and tribulations, and you want to be a better person, and then you have these enemies who you think are screwing yourself over but also screwing the people over, and these incredible kind of like decisions that you have to go through, which maybe we can illustrate by going to his experience of the Great Leap Forward as a bit of a case study in when you see really horrific things happening, how you kind of respond to it as understanding that you are just an atom in this broader system.
Yeah, so the Great Leap Forward, it's interesting because for reasons I described already, he had a very powerful insight into what was going on throughout the country because of his relationship with the civil ministries and the Petition Bureau, and he nevertheless was someone at the same time he is trying to radicalize the government apparatus and he's saying all these remarkably leftist and extreme things about how individualism is a virus. Even if you're a heavy-set person, if even the tiniest bit of the virus gets into you, it will engulf you and consume you very quickly. And this idea of there being a constant inner struggle within every human being to destroy the individualism and the bourgeois, and that one of the ways you do that is through physical labor, right? You go help build a dam, or you're sent to the countryside. And he warns people, you think you're so expert, but really you don't know nearly as much as the peasants do. And he's facilitating this radicalization by calling for things like big character posters, right? By empowering non-technical people to criticize technical people. And that's foreshadowing something that I don't need to describe to you as historians of Chinese politics. And, later on in private conversations in the 1980s, Xi Zhongxun would talk about how he had tried to prevent things from getting even worse. He claims to have ended the campaign to kill sparrows, one of the most famous elements of the Great Leap Forward. He complains to have tried to protect people like Li Rui by giving him a less serious political categorization. And he was involved in the famine relief, right? He was going to the countryside, and he was a peasant, he saw people like putting like a mound of dirt and putting seeds in it, and saying that people were saying, oh, you're creating more space for more growth. And he's like, it's not, he knew it didn't work that way, right? He would talk about how there were fields where like the crops were on the outer rim, and then you pass the crops inside and the whole field is empty, and that kind of thing. So he's learning essentially also about what a culture of fear does to the party. And so he also is talking about how people would, watch him as he tried to fix things, and then feel grudges toward him, and then wait, and then come back at him. And what's interesting, is so interesting about this is he talks about some of his experiences during the Great Leap Forward and this habit of lying, and how lying is so dangerous for the party. In the speech where he's talking about the fall of Hu Yaobang, and Hu Yaobang has just been defeated, and we know Xi Zhongxun is unhappy, and he knows all of these alleged crimes against Hu Yaobang are fanciful, and he knows that this is a violation of collective leadership. And he says all of these horrible things about Hu Yaobang that we know he didn't believe, and he's praising Deng for actually being a collective leader, and saying Hu Yaobang was not a collective leader because he would just make these sudden decisions. And then it's almost certain that he doesn't believe these things. And in that same speech, he's talking about the Great Leap Forward as a dangerous moment where people were lying too much. So, how you explain that, I don't really know, but it's interesting that he was reflecting on the Great Leap Forward at that particular moment. So,
one of Xi Zhongxun, as you mentioned, he has in the book, his portfolio is quite large, and one of them is managing, at least in part, the Soviet experts at the time. Mm-hmm. And one plausible partial interpretation of the Great Leap Forward is as part of Mao's growing out of love with the idea of fully implementing the Soviet model in China. So I'm curious, how you think that plays into all this, with Xi Zhongxun's role as sort of mediator with the Soviets? And this is also at the time where Xi is sort of traveling for the first period in his life, and going mostly to the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, the story of global communism is a big part of the book that we haven't talked a lot about yet. And the relationship between China and the Soviet Union in the 50s and early 60s is part of that. And the reason it's part of Xi's life is, as you said, he was managing the Soviet expert program, and he was visiting Eastern Europe semi-regularly. And he's also part of the Great Leap Forward, which, as you said, is part of a reaction to Mao drawing certain conclusions about the trajectory of the October Revolution, and Mao's preoccupation about how China can do it better, and that the Soviets are no longer ambitious enough, aggressive enough, and that he is going to show them that there is an even better model than the one that Xi Zhongxun had helped export wholesale for much of the 1950s into the People's Republic of China. And it's interesting too, right? So in 1962, as I said, Mao Zedong is thinking a lot about class struggle, and it's with this preoccupation with class struggle that gets Xi Zhongxun in trouble. And why is he thinking about class struggle so much? Well, one of the biggest reasons is he's worrying about what happened in the Soviet Union. And, he's concluding that the reason the Soviet Union has become bureaucratic and privileged, and he's concluding that the reason the Soviet Union isn't aggressively opposing American interests. He's unhappy with détente and peaceful coexistence. He says the reason this is happening is because of revisionism. So revisionism is another word saying that they're not really communists anymore, that they're heretics, right? And he's worried about this happening at home. So he's talking about class struggle. He's thinking about class struggle. And that's one of the reasons he reacted so strongly to this novel in 1962 that saw Xi Zhongxun purged. And one of the many crimes that Xi Zhongxun found himself facing was that he was a spy for the Soviet Union.
We talked about this when we had Sergei Radchenko. We interviewed Sergei Radchenko.
Great.
Whether or not there was this real ideological divergence at this point between them when Mao uses terms like revisionism, he thinks not. The best I could do to maybe steelman the case, though, is that it seems like when Mao is saying something like revisionism, he's talking about, this obsession with like material interests or like, I think there was somewhere with some source said that he had read New Class by Milan Deziles, which I don't know if that's true or not. But it's like this idea that people are putting material interest, even if it's within a planned structure, is sort of anathema to him, who is more concerned with, some sort of jingshan or like a spirit for forging a new man and a new world. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I admire Sergei so much, and I think he's right that in many cases when we would think ideology would matter, it didn't, and that there are lots of cases where competing interests really explain a lot. But ideology and factions, these two concepts, they have something in common with each other, which is that they can mean so many different things. And so to say that ideology explains everything or that it doesn't explain anything at all, I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. I think that ideology mattered in certain times in certain ways and that it shouldn't either be understated or overstated. And so I don't think that China and the Soviet Union split for ideological reasons, but I think that the reason the split was so serious and that it was so hard to fix and that it happened in a particular way did have something to do with ideology, which is, again, getting to this habit of Mao of explaining differences as being a manifestation of something deeper than reasonable people drawing reasonable conclusions.
Shall we move on to the years in exile?
Great. So how did she get purged?
There was the trigger and then there was the political background. So what was the trigger? There was a woman who was the sister to Liu Jingfan, who was another revolutionary from the Northwest and was also the younger brother of Liu Zhidan, the first great mentor of Xi Zhongxun. She is asked to write about Liu Zhidan, this woman whose name is Li Jiantong. And at first, Xi Zhongxun tells her not to. He's very cautious. He thinks it's a mistake. There is, of course, Gao Gang, who is really making it hard to talk about the Northwest because he's been purged a few years earlier. Another level of sensitivity is what happened to Peng Dehuai in 1959 because Peng Dehuai had a very close relationship with the Northwesterners. He wasn't just the commander to the commissar in Xi Zhongxun on the Northwest battlefield. When Peng Dehuai was fighting in the Korean War, Gao Gang was head of the Northeast and was the guy who got him all of the materials that he needed. He was sort of the logistical machine for Peng Dehuai. So they were quite close. So then Li Jiantong, she keeps pressuring him, and then she enlists all of these other Northwest revolutionaries, and they all put pressure on him, and they say, you're the only one who hasn't died or been purged, and we really need you to give approval to this because we really care about Liu Zhidan, right? And so Xi Zhongxun finally accedes, but he also gives all this advice about how and why she should be careful, right? And he's still not really all that enthusiastic. And he says, you should talk a lot about Mao, right? And then he says, you should also need to go talk to this guy Yan Hongyan. So who is Yan Hongyan? Well, in the 1940s, Mao was trying to pick a Northwesterner to represent them as a group that he could then ally with. And he picks Gao Gang. But this other guy, Yan Hongyan, he hates Gao Gang. He thinks that Yan has the revolutionary prestige and status that should justify him as being the leader of the Northwesterners. He's really, really, really unhappy about this. And then, when Gao Gang is purged in the early 1950s, Yan Hongyan is thrilled, right? And he's hoping that this is going to facilitate a revision of history that recognizes what he thinks is his rightful place. So when parts of this novel are published, Yan Hongyan is furious because he thinks this is moving backwards in the direction that he hoped, which was to make sure that Gao Gang is never rehabilitated and people like him get the respect that he thinks he deserved. He doesn't believe that Li Jiantong wrote it. He thinks Xi Zhongxun wrote it. He doesn't think that this woman could have produced such a work, and so he complains. Now, it's not exactly clear what he thought would happen, but people within the leadership take this novel and they go to Mao and they say, why is this novel being written right now? And what is right now? Well, it's a very sensitive political moment because Mao, for a whole bunch of reasons, is really preoccupied on class struggle, really worried about class struggle. It's many members of the elite who are using this to show Mao that they can find trouble when it rears its head, and they can bring it to him and warn him so that it can be resolved before it becomes a bigger issue. And so Xi Zhongxun, we don't know whether Mao actually believed that this was a counter-revolutionary novel. It may have just been useful for him to talk about it in that particular way. But for whatever reason it was, it led to 16 years of persecution.
Which is fucking insane.
Well, there's a logic
Right?
to it, to why it happened, but it certainly
I mean,
was,
that whole period of Chinese history is effing insane. So add another one onto that.
And then the craziest thing is like Xi Zhongxun, he's spending years and years and years reflecting on what it is that he did wrong in this, and he's doing all this like self-criticism and did I misinterpret something? What was my party error? And then 40 years later, he's like, no, I actually didn't do anything wrong. Like, these people are fucking crazy. But it took him a while to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, too, that my book is a book of history, and so much of that 16 years is Xi Zhongxun doing self-criticism about his history, and then when he's fighting for rehabilitation, which actually doesn't happen fully until several years after he returns to work, it's these constant battles about how his life should be understood by the party. So it speaks to how much these people, their entire sense of self-worth, their entire worldview is shaped by how the party is characterizing them.
Let's talk about that turn for a second, because like going from the self-flagellation to the let me do everything I can to convince these people that actually, no, my self-flagellation was wrong and I was like not a bad guy the whole time. I mean, it's a weird turn, right?
Yeah, you're right, actually. Absolutely. Yeah. So whether when he was actually writing the self-criticism, he was forcing himself to believe what he was writing because he recognized that the party is always right, or he was just doing it to get by. That's an interesting question. We can only conjecture what was really going through his mind. My suspicion is that he really did. He found the charges ridiculous. He thought they were outrageous. But that gradually and painfully and emotionally, he forced himself to come as close to acknowledging the charges as he could, because he recognized the possibility that it was his individuality that was the problem. And he had this faith in the party always being right and in Mao always being right. And then when he saw the party moving in another direction and he saw space for his case to be revisited, you can see him seeing it from the other perspective, which is he cares so much about there being a better evaluation of him that he would fight tooth and nail for it. Right. And so, we can only guess as to what his interiority was during this time. But ultimately, you put the party's interest first. And if that means self-criticism, if that means transforming yourself, then that's what happens.
Yeah, I mean,
and also one other thing, too, is you want to do a good self-criticism because you don't want to hurt other people. All right. Because if you fight it, it just makes things worse. Because it drags in other people, and the party decides that they need to do even more to punish you, to scare you, and to get you to break, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, who was the guy who was like, who like tried to kill himself, and everyone was like, why did you try to kill yourself? Like, you could have just, there's only words, you could have just chilled out and things would have come back around.
Well, there is also this interesting hope that if the party is always right and you have faith in yourself, that even if you've made mistakes, even if you've done something terribly wrong, you can still win back the party's trust by going so far to acknowledge that the party is right, even when they're going after you, and then to work even harder to show how good you are at your job and how devoted you are. And so you're actually talking, the quote is from Xi Zhongxun. It's Xi Zhongxun to Gao Gang, right? So there might have been
Yeah.
this hope that even if you are going to be persecuted, even if you are going to be attacked, that doesn't mean that you can't do revolution anymore. It means you do revolution on a smaller scale, or it might mean that you can't do revolution for a little while and then later on you come back. And there's this kind of remarkable statement that Xi Zhongxun makes in the 1980s, where apparently he says to somebody like, people come up, they go down, it's cyclical. You can't hold grudges. It's just how our party works. It's almost like Democrats and Republicans and political parties in Western societies, right? So there is this hope that they will get your case right, because even if you were wrong and even if you failed, your heart is still clean and you can still prove it to them if you work even harder to dig yourself out of that hole.
Yeah. I mean, I think psychologically it is easier to stay in that mode than it is to question the essence of this and whether this, all the decisions you've made leading up to that moment were actually fighting for something which is like
Oh yeah,
bad.
100%. Like, so you're faced with two choices. One is to say that everything you've done so far is wrong, and you know that now because the party turned against you. That's so much harder, exactly as you said, than saying that I wasn't good enough to the party. I was the one who made the mistake. I was the one who allowed myself to be shot by the sugar-coated bullets of bourgeois liberalization, right? I mean, this is how they thought. I mean, even Xi Zhongxun himself kept warning people that there's no stasis, there's no equilibrium, there's no point where you are invulnerable to mistakes, because individualism, it keeps creeping back in. It's, you have to keep fighting it. And the more confident you are, the more vulnerable you are, right? It's an interesting way of thinking about the world, right?
This whole idea of just like all these leaders as like the people like most into therapy that you could ever come across. I mean, all they're trying to do is like reform themselves and shape themselves and interrogate what it was about them as individuals that led them to do this deviation instead of that deviation. I mean, the sort of like, on the one hand, they're trying to create themselves into these like automatons, but there's so much like dialogue with their own interiority and individuality, which they're trying to like squeeze out of, but can't because they're human beings. I mean, it's and then you're basically stuck in this like weird version of it's almost like he has nothing else to do for 17 years aside from like doing the equivalent of like screwing in iPhones and just meditating on himself and all his mistakes and how he thought this wrong thing at this time.
Well, that's what makes him so interesting, is that when he comes out the other end, it's remarkable how reflective he is, but it's also remarkable how many limitations still to confine him.
How about a quote? This is one of the quotes that has stuck with me the most. I don't know where you mined this. A guy named Jinping, who worked with Xi Zhongxun in a factory when he was exiled. I guess he was in Henan in Luoyang for close to a decade. This happened.
He was there twice, both before and in the later years of the Cultural Revolution.
So this one is from 1976, so the very late years, near the finale. But at this point, Deng is being widely denounced and criticized. And Yang Ping goes into Xi Zhongxun's apartment in 8 p.m. one night, and he's surprised to find Xi, and you say, drinking strong, cheap liquor and crying alone in the dark. He explained that it was his son Jinping's birthday. Xi said, quote, "Your father is better than I am. He took such good care of you. I am also a father, but because of me, Jinping only narrowly escaped death." And then at the end of this same paragraph is the thing that stuck with me the most, which you describe it as Xi Jinping comes to visit him a few days later, and he has him, they're both sweltering because it's the summer, and they're both sitting in their underwear smoking as Jinping recited Mao's speeches from memory while Tixin watched. This is, made me reflect on my own father-son, my relationship with my father. We never do anything like this. But it does make you think, like, if you have a father-son relationship like this, you have at some point near the end of the book, it's, you shouldn't necessarily think of Xi Jinping as, how could a party that treated my father so badly, how could I be loyal to it? But rather the inverse of my father, who has sacrificed so much for it, yet still is this loyal, wants me to be reciting Mao speeches and is so dedicated. How could I ever transgress that party? I think that in some ways this underwear incident actually helped make that stick a little bit more for me. So it might for other people as well.
Yeah, so Yang Ping, he's struck by this, right? Because he knows that Zhongxun cares about his son. He knows he feels bad about what happened to his son. And the son comes to see him on a rare visit. And what do? They find themselves in the situation as you just described. And it raises questions about, why this is the case, right? And I think one, again, is the political background that we talked about before, which is Xi Zhongxun didn't want his family to be a hotbed for privilege and entitlement and weakness, even though they were high-ranking figures. And one way of addressing that is by being tough. And so Xi Zhongxun had this view that if you're not a very strict disciplinarian, and he was famous as a strict disciplinarian, that when your children grow up, they're not good members of society because they can't live collectively. But even if you are, that strict and you see that strictness as a gift, as a sign of care, as a sign of love, why you would have him recite Mao is an interesting question, right? And so one reason I think is in 1976, Mao is still the lodestar of the communists' sense of meaning for these people, right? And it's interesting that, Mao Zedong used to tell Xi Zhongxun, you're not reading enough. You need to read more. You need to improve your cultural side. You need to improve your ability to think ideologically. And so in a way, he's doing to his son what Mao did to him, which was to tell him to read. And now he's telling him to memorize Mao. And so I think what Xi Zhongxun is hoping is that if you've mastered Mao and you can use Mao's language, you can protect yourself in powerful ways. And it allows you to think ideologically and not purely empirically, right? It allows you to be able to justify what it is that you're doing because I memorized Mao. That's a sign of political capital, of social capital in this kind of society. And then, of course, at this very same time, he's telling other people, Xi Zhongxun, about certain distasteful elements of the Mao era that stuck with him. So, complicated person.
And it's like a catechism, right?
You got to memorize the ancient texts. That's how it works.
I mean, it's kind of weird to me that Xi Jinping ends up going to, where is it, Liangjiahe?
Liangjiahe. Mm-hmm.
Liangjiahe, where
which happens to be Shanxi, happens to be near, where his father. I mean, the sense of historical sprawl, to use this word again, it must have been palpable for him, right? Returning to the roots of not only communism but Chinese civilization. For this self-revolution, continuous rebaptism in Chinese traditional culture and revolutionary legacy.
Mm-hmm. There was another podcast I was watching, and I won't mention it, but which one it is, the interviewer or the interviewee says that the lesson that Xi Jinping likely learned from his experiences coming from the Cultural Revolution was that what really matters is that you come out as the winner so that you can be the one who inflicts whatever it is you will inflict, whatever the Thucydidean line of the weak will bear and the strong will do as they will. Do you think that is a valid read? Because I do feel it is a bit in tension with the sort of getting redder than red interpretation, which I think you might favor and I also sort of favor. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a false binary, frankly.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think that Xi Jinping concluded when he was 15 years old that he needed to be a leader of the country so that he could protect himself and that nobody could ever hurt him. I don't think that's right. But I do think other things. I think that he learned a lot about politics. He learned about the fickleness of human the fickleness of human nature. In fact, he said that literally, really kind of remarkably candid moment. But so how does someone who has seen the fickleness of human nature also have such a preoccupation with ideals and conviction? Well, Stalin was the same way. Stalin was both an idealist and a realist at the same time, right? I don't think that these are binaries. You need to be practical and flexible so you can achieve these idealistic goals, right? And you need to have faith in the final victory to motivate you to work hard and innovate and change so that you can meet the challenges as they emerge and transform. So, Xi Jinping is the top leader. I think that when he does things, we can see how it would fit the goals of a vainglorious person. And I'm sure that Xi Jinping has a healthy sense of personal ambition, but I don't think he differentiates that from the party's interests at all. I think that he almost sees himself as an avatar for party interests. He probably almost sees himself as like a person inside a machine pushing all those buttons, and then the machine itself is actually this purposeful, device that's useful for the party to achieve its goals. So I think both of those things are there at the same time. right? That what's good for him is good for the party because the party is an organizational weapon, because it has a core. And what the core does is it imposes discipline and cohesion, even on people who might have their own views, who might be susceptible to corruption and individualism and materialism and all of these peaceful evolution things. And that he is there to stop that. And that's why he needs the power that he has brought into himself. You don't agree? It sounds like.
I fully agree. Actually, I'm glad you call it the false dichotomy, because if you read, as I just spent like 2 months of my life reading, the Robert Moses biography by Robert Caro, brilliant book. I think the best single volume biography other than this, of course. It exactly explains that this is an idealist who becomes a realist in one, but the ideals don't necessarily match with what other people would want. And Niall Ferguson's biography, which I haven't fully read, of a Kissinger, is also, the first volume is called The Idealist. So people who are considered realists often not seem to be quite idealistic. So it seems like it would be quite wrong to put them as a dichotomy.
Well, if you think your goals deserve a lot of idealism, you can do anything to reach them. So it's this interesting, you can be as utilitarian as you need to be precisely because you have so much conviction that the final goal deserves so much sacrifice.
Let's talk a little bit about, I mean, we sort of jumped to the conclusion here, but like Xi's experience during the Cultural Revolution and, you know, how his relationship to his father played into that.
Man, I thought we were going to talk about practice as the sole criterion of truth and the two whatevers and...
All right, fine. Okay.
Now we're, you know, doing this armchair Freudianism. I mean, if you want,
all
the
right.
book has a pipe, it has a cave. We can do it. I mean, we can put them on the couch if you want to.
Okay, you know what?
You tell me, man.
This is your time to shine.
No, I'm being playful. We can. I mean, but
no,
to be fair,
serious.
To be fair, Xi Jinping's experiences during the Cultural Revolution are obviously formative, right? I mean, Xi Jinping, before he came to power, talked about them all the time. And he talked about how when he went to the countryside, he brought these dogmatic ideas from the capital. He couldn't get along with the peasants. He was too extreme. He ran away once because it was too hard for him. The physical labor was overwhelming. He was constantly getting bitten by bed bugs. And he said that he doubted, you know, but because he went back to it, his faith is so much more unshakable than somebody who didn't go through that process. And he says that anybody who's gone through that, nothing could make you tougher, right? Now that raises an interesting question, right? Which is, okay, so you need to go through doubt to have strong conviction. Well, what happens if you go through doubt and you don't come out on the other side with strong conviction? How do you, should you subject people to doubt? What kind of doubt is good and what kind of doubt is bad? What kind of suffering leads to dedication and what kind leads to alienation? And is it situational or is it dispositional? These are all very interesting questions to think about.
Yeah, you got this cute line in your acknowledgments. You write that this book will likely not be welcomed in the PRC at the time of publication. It's a somewhat ironic outcome. Xi Jinping once said that his devotion to the legacy of the revolution, it was the result of undergoing a period of doubt when seeing the past at its worst. If the evidence shared in this book helps explain his own choices, why would the party doubt that others would not draw different conclusions about his family's forging?
You know, in a way, I don't know if you watched this TV show about Xi Zhongxun that was produced on the mainland. It was all these episodes, and I was pretty excited. I spent like years of my life studying this guy, and now I get to see him on television, and I thought at the very least it would be exciting and that it would be, I could hear the clarion call through the show of, you know, Xi Jinping speaking to young people, and I didn't hear it. Why? Because it didn't have any grit. It didn't have any sense of hazard. It didn't have any sense of risk. It was kind of maudlin and sentimental, and there were a lot of monologues, and the revolution was kind of like a dinner party in a way, to turn Mao's phrase on its head. And I found that almost less inspiring than my book, where you have all the warts and everything. Like, I can kind of get Xi Zhongxun a little bit when I look at the pages that I wrote, but I couldn't get him watching this TV show that should have been even more inspiring because you cut out all of the bad stuff, if you know what I'm saying. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well here.
It's like what Kathleen
No, that
Kennedy and Disney did to Star Wars and other movies.
You know, I think I'm gonna have Tony Gilroy on to talk about Andor, and the thing I'm going to pitch him, because Andor, he's talked about how it was inspired by reading history and kind of Stalin in particular as its protagonist, and I'm like, dude, you got to do Xi Zhongxun next. Like he deserves his own like Star Wars inspired inspiration. And I was literally like, I wanted to like put your book into ChatGPT and use it as a just to start to get my hands dirty from like a screenwriting perspective of like what's the 10 episode miniseries, because I really think it is there, and it's such like a sad irony that the party has all this incredible material, which I think you can turn into something very kind of inspiring from a like love the party perspective. But the fact that they're too scared to do that, I think, is sort of very instructive of where we are as where we are in sort of Xi era China, and how they view and don't view history as an instrument.
I mean, this is what I try to do with the book, is to show that the party doesn't just have coercive power. It doesn't just have organizational power. It has real emotional power. And for people trying to figure out how to find meaning in their lives, Xi Jinping telling young people to eat bitterness, telling them to go to the countryside, telling them to learn from their forebears, I'm sure that a lot of people are not going to react to that positively, because they want to 润学, meaning they want to learn how to live overseas, or they want to 躺平, meaning they want to lie down. And for Xi Jinping, those are existential problems, because if the young people aren't on board, then that's peaceful evolution, baby, and you don't want to have that to happen. But I also believe that his message is probably not totally unpersuasive for everyone. I think that there is something human about wanting to be bigger than yourself, and that national rejuvenation is something that you would find meaningful to sacrifice for, and collective values are something that people are often attracted to. And so emotionally, I kind of get it. What emerges, however, from this kind of system is not just all of this excitement and meaning, but terrible suffering as well. And whatever conclusions people want to draw from that is up to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we struggle with a lot now, is like trying to understand the appeal that communism had in the 1900s, 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, both in the countries where revolution was happening, as well as in the West, where you had big chunks of the Western educated world, which found an incredible sort of like inspirational power in this. And what we have with like democratic socialism in America is like such weak sauce compared to what was being on offer to Xi Zhongxun in when he was a teenager in Shanxi.
Yeah, I mean, like there's one way of living life, which is Netflix, dinner parties, brunch, consuming, materialism, watching Andor. And there's another where you're a member of an organization that is leading your country to a rightful place in the world that had been lost for centuries, right? I mean, and like I said, choosing to support the kind of mission has repercussions, often tragic repercussions. So I'm helping people understand these decisions, and also helping people understand the implications of those decisions.
Let's talk about how Xi Zhongxun finally out of the wilderness and makes it back.
There's this dramatic moment, right, where Xi Zhongxun is crying again. It's a different moment in time when he's crying, and this time he's crying in front of a picture of Zhou Enlai, who's just died, and it's sobbing, it's uncontrolled crying, and I've wondered who he's crying for, whether he's crying for Zhou Enlai or whether he's crying for someone else, whether he's crying for himself. Because the death of Zhou raises questions about what's going to happen next. Mao is still alive. It's unclear what the succession is going to be. And there had been a brief moment when Deng had been brought back to power, when it seemed like the nation was finally digging itself out of the hole in which it had found itself during the Cultural Revolution. Mao dies, another wrenching experience. Again, no matter how much he had reflected, Mao was so deeply meaningful to him in so many different ways. And then the Gang of Four are arrested. And Mao's initial successor is this man, Hua Guofeng. And so Xi Zhongxun is rehabilitated primarily by Hua Guofeng and Wang Dongxing, who is in charge of the special case committees and propaganda, actually. And Xi Zhongxun, the decision to send him to Guangdong apparently is made not by Deng Xiaoping, but by Ye Jianning, who at the time was sort of a triumvirate, along with Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping. And it's interesting, right, that his first job is in Guangdong. And why is it interesting? Because it's really obvious in Guangdong how bad things are, right? Because the Gang of Four had connections there, Lin Biao had connections there. There's all these killings that had happened there. It's right on the border with Hong Kong. Tens of thousands of people are fleeing to Hong Kong, many of them are dying in the process. You can literally see across the street, across the river, how far behind China had come. And so he's actually, his case against him is not revised until 1980, right? So he's back to work, but on the books, he's still not fully rehabilitated, which is also kind of interesting, right?
I want to stay on that moment though, you have some quotes that speak to this, but like, it must be such a disorienting thing where it's like your project and the thing that you've devoted your life to and the thing that you've countenanced kind of taking 20 years out of your life and killing tens of millions of people is just losing to these, colonialist, capitalists, bourgeois people. And,
Yeah, exactly.
he has to like grapple with that. And on the one hand, he's like, look, we need to educate them spiritually that like capitalism is bad. But he also understands like, look, if we don't step our game up, look, people want to eat. They want to provide for themselves and their family. And me telling them war stories about Shanxi in the 1920s is not gonna stop folks from leaking out of my socialist not so paradise.
So it's another dilemma, right? On the one hand, you see the sources of political order and belief. On the other hand, if socialism means empty bellies, that's also dangerous. So it's another balance that's hard to get right. And you see him reflecting on it and thinking about it in real time, like how you can achieve economic development without giving up on the ideology, and how you can make sure people take ideology seriously, even as their lives are getting better, and even as you're changing things in society that raise questions about what the heck socialism is in the first place.
The other important thing while Xi Zhongxun is in Guangdong, how much he's responsible for the reforms, the special economic zones being the most, maybe the most pronounced. And you also see the contradiction that you mentioned that is sort of a through line where you mentioned he has a very substantial role in the special economic zones, but is, at least initially, seems to be against the household responsibility system, which just about everybody should know is one of the most important parts of China's economic takeoff again in the late 70s and early 80s. So maybe you can clarify, based on your deep research, how do you distinguish Hua Guofeng, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Zhongxun's respective roles to reform?
So with the special economic zones, how we think about their respective roles, that is a very revealing question, because it speaks to a lot of party historiography and also speaks to the question of how the party functions, right? So the traditional story is that the special economic zones happened because Deng Xiaoping wanted them to happen. And Xi Zhongxun played a big role too. That's part of that story. But actually, Deng Xiaoping wasn't present for most of the work conference in the spring of 1979 that decided they were going to approve the special economic zones. It's important that Deng gave his imprimatur, because it was still a dangerous risk, right? Because they could be accused of being revisionists and Trotskyites and all those things that you accuse communists of for not being true communists. So having Deng's approval was, I don't want to discount it, but it's also very clear that it was Hua Guofeng that was the main driver in terms of supporting the idea in the beginning when it was first introduced, right? And we know that because of both memoir accounts and archival accounts, that when Xi Zhongxun went back to Guangdong, he was talking mostly about Hua Guofeng and the role that Hua Guofeng had played in this, right? And There's a coda to this, which is in the 1990s. Hua Guofeng tries to visit Xi Zhongxun, and he's not allowed for somewhat mysterious reasons. And then he's finally granted an audience, and Xi Zhongxun says, "People say I'm crazy because I say that you deserve credit for, some of these reforms," which is kind of a remarkable thing to say for a lot of reasons, right? But the relationship between Hua Guofeng and Xi Zhongxun is interesting, right? Because when Xi is brought to Beijing to work on the secretariat, he does what he's supposed to do. And he says all of these horrible things about Hua Guofeng that he probably didn't believe to signify that he was now on board with the new order that was marked by Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang.
I mean, it's just kind of remarkable. And I think people should reflect on this. You have this whole idea of like the Mao Deng transition, and so many people who write histories of it. This clear delineation. Deng is the reformer, and he basically does get all the credit in the party's details and then the Western retellings of it. But here we have Hua Guofeng, who is typically like, if anybody even knows about him in the West, it's like, as you mentioned, the two whatevers, Mao's running dog, so to speak. When if you look historically, it was certainly Deng Xiaoping has far more historical evidence of literally serving as Mao's like right-hand man, running dog, implementing the Great Leap Forward. So it's just sort of remarkable, I think, the sort of maybe mental rejiggering that this requires for some people. For me too.
Well, like saying who deserves credit for reform and opening, I don't like talking in that kind of language, frankly, because this idea of credit, like there is a little bit of a historical element to it, right? Like who did what and when. So it is somewhat empirical, but it's also just such an easily weaponized and politicized debate, because what is reform and opening is an inherently ambiguous idea, and not even the Chinese could really explain it all that well. And so if not for Deng, would reformative opening look the way it did? I don't think so, right? So the bigger point here is that the through line of all these dilemmas that we keep going back to over and over again went through Deng Xiaoping. And what was it? Well, the dilemma was the 3 versus the 4. So what was the 3 and the 4? The 3 was the third plenum, 1978, economic modernization. What was the 4? Well, just a few weeks later, Deng Xiaoping gives another speech where he introduces the 4 cardinal principles, which were very conservative formulation, very conservative. And so people were wondering, like, are we going to reform or not? Now, what's interesting is when Xi Zhongxun saw those remarks, he was happy, apparently, according to his secretary at least, and that Xi Zhongxun said, well, we can't do reform and opening right without the 4 cardinal principles, because it sets a guideline, it sets a red line, it helps us be clear that there are certain things that aren't going to be changed, which is very important. And so you can see, again, that in theory this makes sense, but that in practice it's hard to do at the same time. And so you would have these extraordinary zigzags. Like if we think of the Deng era as a stable era, an era of moving in one direction of economic modernization. But as I already mentioned in the previous episode, as soon as Xi Zhongxun goes to work in Beijing from Guangdong, people think another cultural revolution is happening because of a movie that people are criticizing. And then in 1983, the campaign to eliminate spiritual pollution, people think another cultural revolution is happening. And Xi Zhongxun is really unhappy with this campaign, but nevertheless, he's telling foreigners in meetings that spiritual pollution is a real problem. So, how you maintain order without going too far, especially when the top leader is changing his mind and people are trying to figure out what he thinks, and there's no real clear answer to the right way of going about it. It was a formula for a lot of these really dramatic shifts throughout the entire Deng era. And in some ways, I feel that Xi Jinping is a reaction to this, right? Like I said, I don't want to put him on the couch or anything, but Xi Jinping says, what we're going to do is we're going to not be as radical as the Mao era, but we're also going to recognize that reform and opening created real problems, and we need to resolve them. And I'm the one to do it, right? So we're not rejecting either of these eras, but we're going to find sort of a happy middle. That's what he says he's doing, and I think, but that he's saying that like we're not going to like lurch back and forth, and in that sense, we haven't seen quite as many really stunning things appearing under his rule as we saw during the Deng administration, in my estimation.
So, Xi's next spot is going back to Beijing and working under Hu Yaobang at the Secretariat, and there's a very interesting book by Julian Gerwertz, which is Never Turn Back. And it's a history of the 1980s as this sort of, a word that you would use, possibilityhood of what could have been in terms of political reform. And Hu Yaobang, there's another good recent book, Robert Settinger, The Conscience of the Party, Hu Yaobang. He is he is the, if you say reformer, he's probably the image that would be conjured to mind of this period, and Xi Zhongxun is working under him. So what is there to say about what Xi Zhongxun is doing, and how this sort of gets tied into Xi Zhongxun's own legacy as a reformer?
So at the party life meeting that criticized Hu Yaobang, one of the individuals who was present said to Xi Zhongxun, "You went even farther than Hu Yaobang." And the question becomes, what direction is he going even farther, right? What does that mean? And so to talk about the 1980s, it is a moment that deserves study because the party is trying to determine whether it can move to a new equilibrium or not, both with the ethnic minorities, with society, but not just those two areas. They are also reflectively thinking about how to reorganize politics at the very heart of Zhongnanhai. At the same time, they only considered certain possibilities, and it was really easy for them to get scared when things weren't going well. And so whether you're more impressed by their insights or their limitations, I think is up to the reader. But it's certainly the case that you could see there were good reasons for why that period did not end up in the direction that people looking back now wish that it would. But ultimately, the question of how serious this possibility was forces us to look at certain counterfactuals that are really hard to answer. And I alluded to them a little bit earlier, which is, what are the exact counterfactuals we're talking about? And how likely were they? And can we really control them? And how much can we really guess how different it would be? Because one of the themes of the book is yet another kind of contradiction, which is the continuities are so obvious and they're so strong. Yet at the same time, the sense of contingency and accident and the myriad of all of these different structures, how they actually manifest at a particular moment, can also be something that's hard to guess. And people, even within the system, they couldn't read each other very well. They didn't understand each other very well. And as I said before, the system could change people, right? So let's say that it was somebody who was not Deng Xiaoping who was the leader. Well, Xi Zhongxun whispered privately that power corrupts. Li Rui said the same thing. Li Rui said, I really like Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin used to come to me all the time and ask for advice. And then Jiang Zemin became the top leader, and then he ignored me. And I've seen this kind of person a lot. And he was, clearly also alluding to his relationship with Xi Jinping, right? So it's not a question that's easy to answer, but that's just some food for thought for people that may or may not be useful. But I think one last thing I'll say about Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang, I don't think that they represented two different lines. I think that the problem here wasn't that Deng and Hu had consistently different views of thinking about the world. The problem more was that Hu Yaobang thought he had more space than he really did. He thought that he had Deng's confidence and that he was given a task of achieving modernization but also party control that he too, Hu Yaobang, agreed with, but that he was scapegoated and punished in part because of the student protesters and in part because he didn't handle the succession issue well.
This two-line where you have the leader Mao or the autocratic Deng, and then their deputies is not, to my best knowledge, something you see replicated in the Soviet case. So is it fair to call this a Leninist, a characteristic of a Leninist system?
Yeah, so I think you do a little bit, like the tensions between Brezhnev and Kosygin in some ways mirror some of the problems that we saw in China. What's interesting is the two-line system. Do you know why it was created? It was created because of the lessons they drew from the Soviet Union. Mao was very explicit about this at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. He said, when Stalin died, his named successor, Malenkov, was pushed out. And the reason for that was Stalin didn't give Malenkov enough time before Stalin's death to secure his position and to show that he understood what the right direction of the party should be. So what we in China need to do is we need to allow a successor to essentially run the show long enough ahead of time before Mao dies, so that when Mao dies, somebody who will not allow de-Stalinization to happen in China can hold down the fort and can survive any challenge. And also Mao had this, he was the sage king. He didn't want to be boxed in with day-to-day decision-making, which was a huge problem because if you didn't report to him enough, you got yelled at. If you reported to him too much, you got yelled at, and he got to decide when he was going to be mad. But so Liu Shaoqi, he's brought in so that he can give Mao time to do Mao things, but also so that he can secure himself as a successor, so that when Mao dies, you don't have in China what happened in the Soviet Union, meaning that the named successor is pushed out and then there's a move in a new direction. Now, this is so ironic because Liu Shaoqi, as the successor, as the deputy, he raises fears in Mao's mind of revisionism because Liu Shaoqi is not getting it right even while Mao is alive. Now, again, I've said this before. Liu Shaoqi was not opposing Mao. He did not represent a cohesive, different line compared to Mao. In fact, this one figure who appears in my book, Hu Jiwei, who was at People's Daily for some of the 1980s, he says in the 1980s, boy, I wish there was a Liu Shaoqi line. It's really too bad there wasn't one. And so Mao gets rid of Liu Shaoqi in the most dramatic way possible, which, of course, is the Cultural Revolution, right? So then that's the origins of the two line are related to the Soviet Union as a model. It's related to the succession, and it's related to just the nature of Mao, I think, as a leader. And when Deng comes to power, it's even worse in some ways, right? Because he's not even the chairman of the party. The only thing he is the Central Military Commission. And he's harder to manage in some ways because he doesn't want people to think he's acting like Mao. He doesn't want to act like Mao, but nevertheless, he thinks that he's the core and that the party needs a core. So it's this very confusing environment, and he gives enough rope to Hu Yaobang to hang himself with, I think.
Can you say a little bit more about Leninist pathologies? Because it seems like it sort of all emanates from the really core issue of secession politics, which is obvious, was literally the core focus of your previous book. And this two-line thing is, again, is sort of emanating from trying to solve that. But I guess you could tie this also into democratic centralism, which never, a dialectic that doesn't quite seem to work because it tends to just end in centralism. But what other pathologies do you see? And does Xi Zhongxun's own life sort of bring to bear?
Yeah, maybe pathology is too strong of a word, although it's
Sure.
obviously it can lead to really tragic outcomes, and the reason for those outcomes are structural and can't really ever be fully resolved. But succession politics are one. Ideology, I think, is another dilemma that's really hard to solve. This question of how you take ideology seriously enough, but not too seriously. That also emerges a lot in Xi Zhongxun's life. Another is how you co-opt people, whether you co-opt people, how to do that along with repression, or whether you do more repression, or how you repress but also co-opt at the same time, and how to get that balance right. I think these are all dilemmas that have been with them since the beginning that different leaders bring their own approaches to, but nevertheless remain with the party.